All right. First of all, it's incredible honor and pleasure to be speaking to you. And the you that I'm speaking to is somebody that I would love to know, who are you? That's always my opening question.
Yeah, well, me too.
So there you go, straight away. So okay, who do you think you are?
Who do I think I am? So, so I'll tell you a little story in that regard.
Okay.
Um, Let me just make a small adjustment here. Um, my major Sufi mentor tells a story about meeting a hidden Sufi master in Washington, D.C. His name is Abdulaziz Saeed. He's very, very prominent in the United Nations and in all kinds of peacemaking efforts all over the world. And very few people know that he is a hidden master, except the people that he reveals himself to, which he typically does not do by saying anything obvious. And so my mentor is ushered into his study, which is, of course, very beautiful because he's highly cultured. And Abdulaziz said to him, "What's your cover? You have to have a cover if you're going to do anything effective on the inner planes."
Mm.
So I don't have much of a cover. I'm kind of out there as a public Sufi teacher, um, just because it amuses me. Um, and well, the thing you have to understand about being a public spiritual teacher is that when you hang the sign on, on here saying spiritual teacher, you simultaneously append to your backside one that says kick me. And, um, the real teachers can have fun with it. The unready or unripe teachers will fight with it. And I dance between the edges on a good day. So I got my start in this Sufi stuff in my mid 20s, and after trying to roll my own path, just picking and choosing from different things that seemed interesting. And I had a daily yoga practice and a daily meditation practice, and I went to long Vipassana retreats. And at a certain point, my practice just seemed to get very dry. And I gave it another, once that crystallized for me, I gave it another about a year and a half because, on the theory that being stuck is a process too. And I finally decided that that was, you know, untenable. So I started looking for different, checking out different paths and groups and teachers in the Seattle area, which was, the spiritual supermarket was in full swing at the time. And you could have gone to a class every night of the week for a month at a different center and still not have, you know, engaged everything that was available. And mostly I left by the same door that I went in because there was just something that just didn't quite work for me about all of them. And what I heard about Sufis, when I finally heard about them, I liked. Um, no guru worship because I didn't really want anybody telling me what to do. Um, didn't have to wear some weird costume. I didn't have to wear a white turban, which is, okay. Didn't have to be vegetarian, even though I was. Didn't have to be celibate. Big plus. But I couldn't find Sufis And I eventually, um, I moved out of this horrible tenement apartment building that I was living in, the sort of place where if you complain about the cockroaches, they'll charge you for multiple occupancy. And I moved into this. I took a room in a house, and I was right next door to the local Sufi ashram or whatever. I was there for 2 months before I found out they were right next door. So I went next door to introduce myself one day and got to talking with one of the residents, and he seemed really grounded, present, clear, and I had met some interesting people in my um, in my perambulations of the different groups and paths and so forth in the area. And so I started going to classes there, and I was there for like 7 months, which is about 6 months longer than I'd been anywhere else. And finally asked for initiation. And I said, I don't know if this is where I belong, but I'll give it 3 years. And a little under 2 years in, um, I had, I don't know, this sounds grandiose, so I sort of hesitate to use language this way, but the way I characterize it as kind of a shorthand was I had a classical enlightenment experience. I had an experience of transcendence that shattered me,
Hmm.
and it completely shattered my life at the same time because I suddenly saw with inescapable clarity the utter abyss of my ignorance. And it was really at that point, okay, so the next thing was I called my initiator and I said, I have to talk to you. He said, come on over. I didn't say anything else. I walk in the door. He looked at me. He did this double take, broke out into this big smile, and saw what had happened without my saying anything. And it was really kind of at that moment that I realized, oh, there actually are people who know what's going on. I am definitely not one of them. And I entered this path on its terms instead of my own. And I had this wall-sized bookcase of books on spirituality and psychology and personality theory and on and on. And I just looked at that and I went, these people have no idea. And so I packed the whole shebang into boxes and I said, I'm not touching this stuff until I really understand what's going on here. Because I had seen, felt, been um, understanding very clearly that the inner realms, shall we say, the unmanifest, acts upon us here and decisively because it's source. And I did not know how that works. And I was working as a lay, oh, here's the thing. I was working as a lay psychotherapist at the time. And it suddenly just terrified me that I could have been damaging people right and left. And even though working very much inside the theory, it just all looked like a pack of lies. I mean, it's not, but that's just where I was at the time. So that was a lot of years ago. There have been many more such experiences and many more lessons implemented along the way. So who am I? What do you see?
Can you just adjust your microphone a little bit or something because the sound is a little bit muffled, or get
No
it closer.
problem. Let me see what I can do here. I can also speak up a little bit.
That's better. That's better. Whew. Okay, so that whole story that you just told, uh, it almost like took me on a path itself on like what that must have felt like and so on. So like how do you feel about the whole thing now? Like, I mean, do you have some sort of sense of life purpose, or is that like a joke to you almost? How do you look at this?
Um, one of those experiences along the way um, came a few years later, where I was on a long retreat. Um, and I I was rather deeply into my personal melodrama at that point. I had just trashed a career and a relationship with someone that I was really committed to in pretty much one stroke. Um, and so my teacher put me on a retreat, personal retreat. So I was sitting in a little clapboard shack in somebody's avocado orchard in Southern California. And my guide would bring me a little basket of food and a list of practices as long as my arm, with the instructions on how to do them, and don't go to the next one until you get such and such. And I went into this not caring if I died. And consequently, that left me open to receptive to the movement. And I was doing a particular practice that had been given me. It doesn't matter what the practice was, because these things are all grace in a sense anyway. We just, that which of us is most real is always, continually, at every breath, waiting for that little bit of yes, that unguarded moment when our defenses are down, and there's some openness to what in Christian terms they call a new dispensation. And I suddenly remembered having made deciding to take this human incarnation. It's like there was, like, that fast. The first one being, I exist. And the next awareness being, I've got a job to do. I'm going there. First available bus. And from that, there was kind of this tableau where I just saw that my crazy family and my crazy grade school teachers and the whole thing um, was part of my classroom to develop certain things in me, right up to that very moment when I was ready to see it and could take responsibility. And at um, that moment marked the expiration date of my um, prerogative to blame anybody else, including my family and all the bullies in school and whatever, because I chose it. I volunteered for this. And so the short answer to your question is yes, I have a sense of my purpose. I can't always put that into language.
Hmm.
I but it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
It's kind of a navigational fix.
Mhm.
The way if I had a sailboat, if I was sailing from Seattle to Honolulu, I would be taking a navigational fix on the North Star.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah.
And so the purpose isn't so much a destination
Mhm.
as it is an attitude.
Mhm. And so how do you feel about life now? Like, talk to me about your feelings. Like, do you feel now in the same way like you
Mm.
felt before this kind of
Oh God, no!
no?
It's universally apart. I felt really condemned to life in a sense before I had that experience, and it took me some years to integrate it. But the critical thing was that I saw through my own melodrama.
Mhm.
It's like I saw through it and I couldn't get behind it anymore because I knew it wasn't real.
Mm.
And then it took me some years to kind of rebuild the parts of my ego that I needed to, basically tearing them down and then rebuilding them brick by brick in alignment with what had been shown to me. Um, and now life is a hoot. I have my moments where stuff just doesn't work out and I'm pissed or I'm disappointed or you know, but it's universe is different than it was. It's like this is all workable. I got this.
Yeah. I realized when I asked the question, I realized how it's incredibly double interpretative, so to
Hmm.
speak. Because what I meant by the question is, do you like, for example, in the past, if I was looking at something like my hand, for example, I would just think, oh, it's a stupid hand, like why can't I play good piano with this hand or something like that. So my feeling towards that would be like, oh, it's like such like a boring thing. But now looking at the same hand, I would feel completely different feelings, just even with that simple thing. So I'm asking you, how do you feel about the same things today? And how is your feeling like as a verb working now compared to
Okay.
pre that? Yeah.
There's a couple of things. One of them being, I am no longer the guy that was bullied, rejected, shut out, fired. Um, you know, just,
It's amazing how we remember all these bad things so well. It's
yeah,
like the list goes on.
yeah, and I'm not interested in that litany anymore. It simply doesn't compel me. It doesn't have any traction. All of those things really happened, and objectively, I can say that there was some injustice and there was some misunderstanding. There was all kinds of stuff that could have, would have, should have been different. And I won't say that it's not real, but I don't have the kind of emotional loading on it that I had at that time. Um, and there's, like I said, there's just this felt sense that shit's workable. I can do this. I have the resources.
And that's,
And
yeah, that's a very, very different uh, way to approach things, right? It's a completely different perspective on the same thing. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Um, and I don't feel, the other thing is I don't feel damaged
Uh,
by those things.
uh,
I don't feel that there was something irreparable about me.
Mm.
And I guess it was giving me a different kind of compassion for people who are um, misfits. And this society so values conformity that we've got a lot of misfits. Maybe we got more misfits than people who actually can make, the standard prescription work.
Mm. Mm. So, like, what is your take on religion versus spirituality, or religion, spirituality, those kind of things, in terms of, because I hear a lot of people are like, religion has ruined the world, blah blah blah, things like that. Um and then the religious people, for example, who are not wanting to sort of throw the baby with the bathwater there, but kind of don't feel right about it, but want to kind of almost like want to improve it in a sense. Uh, Talk to me somewhat about that, because I'd
Well,
love to hear your point of view.
when I first began getting turned on to my own possibilities, mostly through psychotherapy and body work at the beginning of my journey before I learned to meditate and so forth. Um, okay, so I was raised in a secular family. My parents are different religions. My mother was an atheist and my father was an engineer. And um, so I didn't get any religious indoctrination as a kid. And holidays were secular affairs. And just for the hay of it, though, in high school, I read all of the scriptures and couldn't make any sense of it for the most part. So when I began freeing myself from myself, uh, what I began to see about conventional religion was all of the ways that it oppresses people and robs them of their mental, emotional, and spiritual freedom. And if I'd had the magic wand, I would have disappeared religion from the face of the earth in one stroke. And that would have been a huge mistake. So I think it's a very nuanced conversation. And there there is something in okay, I can't especially through this medium, but just perhaps in general, I don't have the capacity to transmit what I'm about to say. Like I can't osmose you into the experience that I have of it.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Um, what I can say is that when I look at these things on the inside of life from the perspective of the boundless, what I perceive is that there is this continual movement of the divine and of divine guidance into manifestation. And one of the particularizations of that, there's several particularizations of it. One of them is conventional religion. It's like there's a stream that that there's a new one given every so often, and somebody is awake enough at the time to pick it up. We call them prophets, and they're getting the download directly from source. It's not channeled. That's a different thing. Um, and they are they're made into the kind of instrument that particularization needs in order to get embodied. And if you read the lives of the historical prophets, it was rough because it didn't ask permission. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
and so there's two aspects of that. One of them is, here's the list of how to behave. So that creates civil society. The other level, which is the esoteric rather than the exoteric, is the piece of that transmission that is available to those few souls who have the capacity to follow in the prophet's inner footsteps, not necessarily outer footsteps. So we get religions on one hand and we have spiritual schools on the other. And in the ideal world, the exoteric religion would be the kitchen or the soup that's being prepared for the few that can actually assimilate it. And what usually happens is in 2 or 3 or 4 generations, the exoteric religion gets reified, and the people who need to control the people around them and who really, really need a certain structure to order their lives. And that's why it would have been a terrible idea to disappear religion from the world, because they would be lost. That would not have been a kindness.
Yeah, it's amazing to me to what extent people ask for and want a framework and structure and a set of rules to follow or steps or process, and then whatever you give them, and this I've seen happen in any sort of corporate transformation role
Yep.
that I've ever had. you know People hate the current system, they want to change it, they're complaining about it. Then you go around, ask them what is it that they want, you put that into framework process, you present it to them, and then they're like, don't like that either. And whatever you present to them, they'll always find reason for not following that new process, new system, uh, to the point where I've actually had you know quite bizarre situations where I worked with people who've designed their own system and then not wanted to follow it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so it's such a human thing to do that.
It's a human thing. And I think the reality is that it takes a certain kind of ego strength to venture into those realms where there is no control and there is no certainty. So that first, enlightenment experience that I had frightened me deeply. It was weeks before I could, whatever the practice was that I was doing, and again, it doesn't matter, but it was weeks before I could even attempt to do that again because it frightened me so much because I was such a control freak. And I had not yet developed the relationship with that inner guidance that I could voluntarily let go at that very deep level and allow myself to be carried. And so there's just, and I really had to, in a sense, develop the ego strength rather than dismantling structure at a certain point. I needed to build some structure in before the stuff that was not useful could be let go of. And there's kind of a basic principle there, which is that all the problems that we have were at one time solutions to other problems. And we're not going to let go of them until we've got something better to put in their place. And so I'm very cautious about working with people's defenses anymore. They'll let go of it when they no longer need it. There was a time when I thought our defenses and the ego was the enemy and kill the damn thing. And again, it's like disappearing religion. It's not the way to go. That's not actually how it works. And the power of some of the practices that are available in the wisdom traditions are such that there's no guarantees, and you can go crazy if you don't have the right holding, both internally and from your teacher, which is one of the things that teachers do.
Yeah.
They hold you in a certain way when life just explodes.
Yeah. Yeah. And someone who's been through certain crazy experiences, who's managed to then retrospectively work them out and sort them out and integrate them, can see somebody else going through a similar sort of experience and actually explain to them that it's not necessarily they're going nuts or anything like that. It's
going nuts. You might be going nuts, but you can handle it. And here's how.
Yeah. You're not going to go nuts to that level that you'll put like a bullet to your head.
or need to be hospitalized or something.
Yeah.
There are discernible stages in this process, and they seem to be pretty common to all the paths. They got different names for them, and they divvy up they divide it up into different ways. There might be 5, or there might be a dozen, or there might be, it doesn't matter. But there are definitely clear thresholds that are crossed where there's new capabilities and new awarenesses that are given. And you can't unsee what's just been shown because it changes you. It's like finding balance on a bicycle the first time. You are forever changed. You may still fall off, but in that moment, your whole being knows what balance on a bicycle is, and you can find your way back to that with the right assistance. And so what the teacher does, a lot of what the teacher does is, like you were saying, having been the route ahead, whatever stage that the student is at is perceptible. And also the pitfalls are known, and there's a lot of them. There's a lot of them. And I was just sharing with someone yesterday that if I have any wisdom at all about this stuff, it's because I've made pretty much every dumb shit mistake in the book, and the singular miracle is that I'm here to tell the tale. So religion and spirituality, they're different things, and they're the same thing. For some people, they find the they find great, not just personal meaningfulness, but deeper reality, connection with the boundless through the symbol system of their faith tradition. And for other people, and they tend to stay kind of inside of that. I'm thinking about um, Father Richard Rohr, who is a very, very great light, and he may not be with us very much longer because he's got stage 4, I don't know, pancreatic cancer or something horrible. But he's inside, he's a free being, and on the outside, he's this Catholic priest, and he navigates between the edges of that with tremendous fluidity. And it's clear to me that he's really speaking from deep, direct experience. And then there's other people who get to the further shore and just completely abandon their vehicle. And I'm not even sure whether to call myself a Sufi anymore. If
Mm.
I'm further shore, I don't know.
Mm.
I'm somewhere further
Yeah,
than I was.
yeah. It's in the book Effortless Mastery. Pianist Kenny Werner talks about freedom within form and freedom outside of form, which in music would be some sort of like free jazz. And then freedom within form would be like Bach 2-part inventions that are based on very strict rules. And you can master that to a level where you're completely free within those strict rules of Bach 2-part inventions.
Yeah,
Or you can
well,
just play free jazz where every note is right and there's no rules and you just gotta let it be. Uh,
having being a classically trained musician, I totally get that, and and especially with Bach. Oh my God, there is such fluidity inside the structure. Um, not all of his pieces, but a lot of them. When you look at the score or listen with the right kind of ear, you can perceive him setting up a statement 6 measures in advance. And there's multiple of those things happening in the same staff and in all the different voices. And yeah, the freedom inside of that when you as the performer are become a vehicle of that is fantastic. It's amazing. It's astounding. And then like we were saying, there's free jazz, but there's also a mastery of the instrument in that is absolutely necessary.
Bach is probably a great example of what we spoke about earlier with the humans not sticking to their own system, because famously Bach got fired. He was like one of the best organists in the history of humanity, but he got fired. He couldn't even get a job playing in the church. Do you know this story?
Tell me, because
So
I think
yeah, so he basically he would write church pieces to be performed with like choirs singing, and then they would say, well, come in and play the organ for this piece, right? Because you wrote the thing, you literally don't need the notes, you know exactly what you wrote. And then he would improvise so much that the choir wouldn't know where they are because he was improvising his own pieces. They just said, we just need somebody to play what's written on the sheets. And they would fire him and get somebody else who's just like a bog standard organist to play what's written. And he'd basically not get like paid work to work as an organist. So he ended up suffering in his life because he was practicing what's basically freedom outside of form within a freedom within form thing. Uh,
I can relate, and that's one of the reasons that I'm not sure that I can call myself a Sufi anymore. It's like what's being pulled out of me by the people that I'm guiding and by the needs of everything around me just doesn't fit in those nice categories anymore.
so is it possible then, because I was brought up a Muslim, and I still consider myself a Muslim, but I'm very sort of liberal Muslim, right? Because I'm originally from Bosnia, and we're kind of in between these two,
Okay,
kind of East and West,
okay,
and all that kind of
I'm
stuff.
I'm, I'm following you.
So, but then it's like, you can sort of transcend that stuff, but when you transcend it, you don't necessarily get rid of it. You can transcend and include. In fact, it's also fun to even go backwards and say, well, actually, Christianity preceded that, then Judaism preceded that, and so in that sense, my inheritance, I'm also a Christian and a Jew, and so on and so forth. And actually, like, backwards journey is
Mhm.
fun to explore,
Yeah.
as well as the forwards journey.
Mhm. Well, your Islam in Bosnia came from the Turks, and the Islam of the Ottomans was very deeply informed by the presence of the Sufis in that culture. And um, just as an historical note, so there's a Bosnian mosque that I visit occasionally, even
Mm,
though I don't consider myself unorthodox. It's like when I'm with Muslims, I'm a Muslim. When I'm with Christians, I'm a Christian.
yeah, yeah, and that's exactly what I'm getting to. That there's, um, you know, that's just perfectly normal, actually.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah.
uh,
In
and
in Central Asia, they have these very small communities of diaspora Jews who don't have their own temple, so they use the mosque,
mm, interesting.
and it's not unusual. Let's say it's not unheard of for there to be Jewish, Christian, Muslim intermarriage in
Yeah,
those, and perfectly acceptable. And um, and I love that, and I also think it's the future.
mm. Yeah. I mean, that was certainly what was very, very commonplace in Bosnia.
Mhm.
And in fact, to us, was completely like, what's the sort of big deal about that until the war hit?
Yeah,
At which point, a lot of people were still going like, what's the big deal? But the oppression from the sort of political agendas was like, that can't happen, and we have to draw the lines through this country. And then it was like, when they were drawing the lines, it was like, holy shit, this is like really a lot more mixed up than we ever thought it was. And yeah, so it's not kind of lines like you see in the Middle East, which are literally drawn by a ruler, like this and like that. It's much more kind of lines like this, and they still don't make sense.
and it still
Uh,
doesn't make sense. I I think I'm making up that we are seeing the sunset of certain patriarchal and authoritarian structures. And like many sunsets, it's the most florid before it goes completely dark.
mm,
And it may get worse before it gets better, but
mm,
it's ultimately unsustainable.
mm.
And I don't know that we're going to have a golden age, but it will get better. Maybe not in my lifetime, but it will get better. We'll go back to, especially I see with the current crop of young people, the millennials, who just don't have any patience for that kind of artificial division and boundaries of religion and nationality and all of those quaint tribalisms.
Yeah, yeah. Because in some sense, like the new generations are on one hand ignorant. Yeah, they're on one
Mhm.
hand ignorant, but in that ignorance there is bliss insofar that they're ignorant of the fact that us lot have gone through a whole bunch of wars, and they're like, we don't care about the war. you know I don't want war. I want to jump on a plane and go to Indonesia for holiday, and I want to then jump on the plane and go to wherever, Switzerland, for a skiing trip, because I got mates there that I met over TikTok, and I don't care about any of the stuff that you lot were quarreling about viciously before. And so, in that sense, I've
Yeah.
found that ignorance is bliss.
Mhm. Mhm. Well, it's what I've seen. I've got a lot of young people in my teaching and social orbit, and whereas my generation was pushing back on the existing structures, the younger people now are simply ignoring them.
Hmm. Yeah, and that ignorance, or if you ignore things, they stop being observed and then they dissipate
Yeah.
naturally. Yeah,
Mhm.
because they're not being charged by positive or negative energies. They're being neutralized by ignorance, which
Mhm.
is quite powerful. And that ignorance, in the sense, like, it can be just worded as letting go. It's like, ignore it, and it will pass, in that sense. So it's an interesting thing that some people phrase all this stuff as, these youngsters don't know, uh, but and as it, like, that's a bad thing. But I'm like, it's better that they don't know, because they're not being coached and skilled up to hate and war. Yeah.
Well, they're not being re-traumatized,
Yes, exactly. Yeah,
and that's a good thing,
yeah, yeah.
in my non-humble opinion.
So it's 22:22 on my clock here, which I keep
Okay.
seeing these synchronicities. So tell me, what do you think about synchronicities? Because I'm literally seeing this, like, 22:22, 11:11 all the time.
I, to me, I mean, in my personal experience, synchronicity is a real thing. I don't pay a lot of attention to clocks and dates because I just know historically that our clocks and our calendar are arbitrary and don't have any particular connection to the cosmic flow of things. At least that's my perspective right now. Um, and there is a felt sense like being in a body of water and feeling a current that's moving in a particular direction. Um, that I perceive those, I can ride them when I choose, when I'm aware of them. Um, there's also a sense that I have personally, that my life is ruled by randomness, and that I just need to stay fluid and stay aware and be ready to let myself be nudged in a productive direction, and that what I need will show up.
Mm. Yeah. You know, when you said where your life has been ruled by randomness, at one point, like a couple of years ago, I asked a friend of mine to teach me some maths because I used to study maths, and then I stopped studying it, and then I got to a point I was like, I really want to learn some more maths, and I have this genius maths teacher, and I said like, can you just teach me some maths? And then started speaking to her. I was like, I want to learn maths that helps me do art. Okay, so like use it for generative programming, generative art. Yeah.
Uh,
And so we started talking, and I said to her like, oh, so like if I use a random number generator, and she was like, hold on a second. I was like, what? She goes, there's no such thing as random numbers. And I said, what do you mean by that? She's like, we don't really know if it's possible to generate random numbers. And then we got into this conversation. I started realizing, even from like a couple of lessons, it chucked me into this like deep contemplative stuff around the things that I always took for granted in maths are not granted whatsoever.
yeah, yeah. There's um,
So what do you mean by random?
um, what do I mean by random? I mean unexpected,
Uh,
unforeseen,
uh-huh.
just things that I could not plan for.
Is that the
Uh,
same as like unconscious or subconscious?
I don't know.
Mm,
That's
yeah.
I don't know because I don't know what I don't know.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I can't be aware of what I'm not aware of.
Yeah,
So there
yeah.
may be something operating unconsciously to me personally, or something in the collective movement of things that I'm not aware of that um, has its own reasons for things. Um, that seems likely,
Hmm.
but I I can only know what's put in front of me,
Mm,
and I used to try to suss out the larger movement of things, and I just couldn't. I just made myself a little nuts trying to do that. It's
yeah.
more That's more complex than I have the capacity to dance with,
Yeah, 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 yeah.
um, or the capacity to engage in any way that makes sense in my human incarnation. Let me put it that way.
Mm, yeah. And
So
I suppose there's also an element of willingness, like to what extent is somebody willing to engage with that as well, because
mhm,
there isn't necessarily perceived value in exploring that kind of a path. Because, like when you were saying, I don't know what I don't know,
mhm,
there is also like a question around, how do you know that you don't know? Because this could be like something that you do know, but you're not aware of that you know. So you call it you don't know.
well, there's that. I mean, there's things that I can language or wrap symbols around, and there's things that I can't.
Yeah,
But nevertheless, um, act upon me in certain ways,
yeah.
or that I perceive them acting in concrete reality or in the mind realm more often.
Hmm.
Um, but how I slice the use of my attention is when it's put in front of me,
Yeah.
especially if I get the indication, do something with this.
Mm. Mm.
And then I look at, okay, how much of my ego is bound up in this? It's a question. Yeah, and I may have plenty of ego tied up in it. That doesn't mean that I shouldn't pursue it.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
But I don't think the ego is bad. I think it's just limited, and it can be destructive when it's not well trained.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, it's sort of, you know, it's like when you go for walks and there's people walking their dog, and you can tell whether it's the person walking their dog or the dog walking.
Yeah.
And, and so the Sufi picture of that is that you train your ego the way you train a dog or a horse, and it can become a wonderful, willing
Mm.
servant
Yeah.
if, if it's given the right training and held and nurtured.
Yeah, like
In,
right incentives. Like
yeah,
right incentives. Like here you go, little bit of this, and like the horse comes to water and drinks. Yeah.
well, and it's not just reward. It's just compassion for yourself, because you're going to have an ego as long as you got a physical body.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
hardwired.
Yeah.
Um, I have met people who seem to spend a majority of their waking moments not being compelled by their self representation.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, but I don't think I've met anyone, and I've met some pretty amazing beings in India and Turkey and elsewhere who we would call, from our perspective, free beings.
Hmm.
And they have egos. They have their preferences. They've got their routines. They've got the way that they do stuff.
Yeah. Practice. Yeah.
And um, so this path considers, I mean, if you're going to have a truly non dual perspective on life, there has to be a place for the ego.
Mm.
This notion of, that one sees mostly on the internet, and it's mostly men. There is no separate I. There is no real I, so therefore none of this matters. Um, that's actually it's actually highly dualistic,
Mm.
and there is an I. There isn't. It just has many layers and many nuances, and sometimes that identity is very personal, and sometimes it's boundless,
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
and it's the same substance.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah.
So, in a sense, God is having this conversation between a Jason and Jason and a Hafizullah, these little encapsulated, like
Yeah.
tapiokas in the cosmic tapioca pudding.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and it's an interesting conversation.
So okay, so I want to, and it's 22:33. See, I'm like seeing these numbers. I know it's like trivial, but like it's
Yeah, I
interesting.
never look at clocks, so there
Uh,
we are.
Me neither. But now I've got this like little silly little like a smartwatch. Like I didn't want to buy Apple Watch, so I bought like a what I call a Shenzhen watch. Look,
Uh,
22:33
okay.
Shenzhen, which is like a cheap version, uh, and so I see the numbers more often, like, because when you've got something on your wrist, there's more kind of tendency to, oh, let me check the time, right? Because I've got
Mhm.
a watch on the wrist.
Sure.
But but that's actually been an interesting, like, reversion back to like old school mentality for me,
Mhm.
in that sense. So I've often, and this is, I'm tracking this question, conscious of your time, even though time is a construct of the mind, probably. But uh, one question: what if all these prophets, right, such as like Jesus, Muhammad, peace be upon him, Buddha, etc., all the prophets got together at the same time? Like, how would they get on, and what would they be chatting about, in your opinion?
They're the same being, the same consciousness in different meat suits.
Hmm.
And they wouldn't be arguing about, or probably even discussing doctrine.
Hmm.
I think they'd be very sad, actually, about what humans have done with what they brought.
Hmm.
I think they are very sad about what humans have done. And the mystics don't, the mystics just perceive and jam at a level outside of the mind,
Mm.
in the depth of the heart, if you will.
Hmm.
And that's the same place. There isn't like Jesus' little piece of it and Prophet Muhammad's little piece of it and Moses' little piece of it interacting. It's all the same. There's
Yeah.
only one of it, and there's so much only one of it that we can't even think about it meaningfully.
Yeah. Yeah, and so then what I sometimes wonder about, and I'll chuck this kind of question to imams and priests and so on, and say, like, imagine if everyone on the planet Earth was enlightened to the level of prophets, what would the world be like, and what would the people around the world be getting? And the answer to that, through some sort of logical deduction, is that they would all be getting the same word of God. And it's not a word like blah 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 blah. It's a feeling, it's a being, it's a sort of configuration of self.
A
and um,
direction.
and they would all be wise enough to understand that peace on earth comes from within inner peace. That is a natural outcome of self clearing, integration, and coming to terms with all these things that we've been discussing, and that
Mhm.
it's completely normal to be peaceful, and if necessary just shut up and enjoy the ride, whatever it
Yeah.
is. Yeah.
Well, I think that too. Um, and it wouldn't surprise me if, because we've all got egos, that if they had heated discussions about their personal preferences about stuff, you know, um, because they've all got, all of these different faith traditions came into it not only with a transformative potential for all of humanity, but also with specific things for the specific community.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And among the mystics, we were just talking about this a few minutes ago. There's this kind of continuum between the totally free spirits who completely abandon the vehicle when you get to the furthest shore and have nothing further to do with it. And then there's the kinds who hold a certain structure because in some of those structures are inherently sanctified,
Mm.
like the Roman Catholic High Mass in Latin
Hmm.
is an inherently sanctified structure.
Mm.
And there's others. There's not a lot of them, but there's a few in my, in my perspective. Uh, and those are worth holding on to because they transmit something essential in a
Mm.
way that other things maybe don't, or maybe they do, but that's a different faith tradition.
Mm.
So there's
Yeah.
a place for all of that. Whether humanity is going to outgrow that, I have no idea.
Mm.
That would just be making things up, and I do that a lot. Um, so, um, that's my perspective on that. It's like there's great beauty in some of those forms,
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Totally.
and I have to say, Sufis have the best hats.
uh, yeah, I feel if anything, like I'm just getting more and more interested in studying religions in not just kind of like from a historical point of view or rhetorical point of view, but from an actual meaning and a deep, actual embedded message that they've perhaps tried originally to communicate, but
Hmm.
it's either got lost in translation, quite literally, because like Alan Watts would say, like Catholics took this Latin mass and then translated it into bad English. Or for what the Protestants did, or I lose track of like which denomination of Christianity did which translation, but yeah, that's like they put the Latin thing into bad English, and then you read that, and it doesn't really make much sense. But uh, so yeah, I think I'd love to have another conversation to continue on this train of thoughts and inspirations, because this is I thought this conversation was going to be fascinating, but it's been not fascinating for me. It's been like mystical experience in a sense for me. I really thank you for chatting to me and carving out some time, for this. And I'd love to, talk to you again, in quite near future, if possible,
Hmm.
about what else comes to mind. And also, there's so many questions I would like to, because in some sense, I've said this to people before. I see, like, for example, someone like you, like, uh, current working, operating version of artificial intelligence, super capable artificial intelligence. So it's like asking a super capable computer a question and seeing what it comes back with, right? And like probably I could ask you the same question 10 times and you'd answer it in 10 different ways.
Right.
And so to me that's like fantastic to see, how different people think.
Well, there's my many years ago, my primary teacher, this was right at the end of a 30-day personal retreat. My primary teacher, who was the head of the order that I'm affiliated with, who was very much a free spirit in his way, a very free being, very much not interested in the traditional forms. And so he gave me a practice which he said would help me articulate some very difficult things in a way that was accessible and inspiring
Mm,
to other people.
wow.
And that seems to have been the case.
Mm,
And I also see that there's a tremendous There's a tremendous danger in that.
Mm.
Because I'm very articulate, it gives the impression that there's something to know,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
there isn't anything to know in that way. That's what's so difficult about this mystical stuff.
It's 22:44. I can't stop looking at this. As you said, there's something to know, and I'm like 22:44. It's like, is that something? And it's probably nothing. But yeah, yeah. So I weirdly, you say that I registered my first trademark, which is called Super Simple Stories, and it's about telling things in three
Mhm.
word statements. And something quite fantastic happens when you do that. You kind of cut out all the BS. But when you do that, you kind of dehumanize thing in some sense. You can
Yeah,
dehumanize it, and there's no kind of room for sort of feeling words and things like that. It's like Jason eats cake. Okay, so it's like subject, verb, object. Okay, and you can express a lot of that. It's in like information architecture. You probably know this is called triple, right? And like Facebook has actually made a big deal of this, because it's like on Facebook you can do this kind of thing. It's like Jason is watching a movie, right? And things like that, or listening to a podcast. So there's very, very powerful statements. But then as I did that, I was like, wow, this is so powerful. But at the same time, it's also very potentially uh, misleading, in a sense that it oversimplifies. Yeah.
it can get disconnected from aliveness.
Mm, yeah. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And it's always finding the balance, right? It's always, I find it, like, more I think about these things, like balance between simplicity and expressivity, or feeling, right? And things like that. And yeah. Yeah.
Let's do this again, maybe in a week.
Sure. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you so much, my brother.
Thank you. This has been a pleasure.
All
All
the
right.
best. All the best.
I must go. Put my little red X. Bye.
Bye.